So if you're dealing with IBS, and specifically IBS-C, which is the constipation version of IBS, it can create a lot of trouble and discomforts in your life. And if you're researching this topic and getting a little frustrated and you're just like, why won't the poop come out? In this video, I'm going to help you understand a little bit more about IBS, give you some studies that you can dig into a little bit further, along with some steps that you can take now to create some immediate improvement for some folks and some steps you can take to improve the situation long term. Let's jump in.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
So remember, I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving anybody medical advice for their IBS, but if I can share some of these studies and give you some insights, it'll help you ask better questions when you're talking to your doctor about this issue. So when we're talking about IBS, this can be a little bit different than IBD. IBS is an irritable bowel syndrome, where IBD is inflammatory bowel disease. And one of the major differences between these two issues is, sometimes it can be about the location of where the trouble is going on. And with inflammatory bowel disease, there's usually physical structures that have been damaged or created some type of major inflammation in that digestive tract, and that's why you get that kind of classification. But IBS is very common. It's often categorized by specific symptoms in that digestive tract that a person is experiencing, but then they got to break it down because there's different types. A person could have IBS-C, which means that they're leaning more towards constipation. IBS-D is leaning more towards a diarrhea issue. IBS-M, or mixed, is maybe they experience both kind of alternating. And then IBS-U is kind of, I don't know, or an unclassified version, or some people might call these different names. Some people will say IBS-A is this constipation. So it can depend on what somebody's calling it, but understand that there can be different versions of what's going on when we're looking at IBS. So in this video, we're going to focus a little bit more on the IBS constipation type. I've made another video for IBS-D and people who lean towards that diarrhea issue. And so if you're dealing with both, maybe you go back and forth a little bit, or maybe sometimes you're more on the constipated side and sometimes you're more on the diarrhea side, you might want to watch both of those videos. And there's a lot of similarities that we're going to go over with both of them, but there are some differences between the constipation and the diarrhea issues that most commonly show up. So I want to do different videos so that I'm not confusing somebody that's just dealing with constipation or just diarrhea. And we'll put links to that other video in the description below this video, and I'll point you to the diarrhea video at the end of this one. But basically, when we're looking at IBS, there usually are some discomforts going on, like gas and bloating. Maybe a person is having cramping, and then there's usually a problem with the bowels where it's just not coming in. They're not pooping like a champion. There's stuff that's coming out that's like lifting them off the toilet like a rocket, or they just sit there for weeks at a time just waiting for poop to come out, and all they do is cuss. So there can be variations there, but there usually is some discomforts that go on. Gas is very common. Bloating is very common. So we're going to talk about those things, and we're going to talk about with some people why some foods cause more trouble than others, and then why there has to be different steps for different types of IBS issues. So one thing that's very popular, and we'll dig into this study here that talks about the efficacy of the low Fodmap diet for treating irritable bowel syndrome. And they say, in summary, the evidence to date indicates that restriction of FODMAPs is an effective dietary intervention for reducing IBS symptoms. There are now well-designed clinical trials to support the efficacy of low FODMAP diet with alleviation of GI symptoms in majority of patients with IBS. And they go on to say that up to 86% of patients with IBS find improvement in overall gastrointestinal symptoms, as well as individual symptoms such as abdominal pain, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, abdominal distension, and flatulence following the diet. Now, if you've tried this, or maybe you've tried some type of elimination diets and you didn't see improvement, I'm going to explain why that comes about as well. But when we're hearing things about this FODMAP diet, what is a FODMAP? I've never eaten a FODMAP before. But what that means is FODMAP stands for fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols. So when we're talking about a FODMAP diet, we're usually talking about a diet that restricts the intake of these FODMAPs, which is any of these categories. And these are mostly different types of carbohydrates and sugars and fibers that come into foods, and when we eat these foods, they have the ability to create and magnify symptoms for people that are dealing with this IBS. So we want to understand why that is a little bit. But what's important is what we're seeing is that when people with IBS restrict these Fodmap type foods, they often see great improvement to their symptoms. Now, I don't feel like this is the solution. This is a way for you to feel a whole lot better. It's nice to feel a whole lot better sometimes. So in the description below this video, I'll put a link to a page on, I think it was ibs.org or something like that, that lists these high Fodmap foods and low Fodmap foods. So a person can take approach of, okay, I'm going to test this out for myself. I'm going to remove all these high Fodmap foods. I'm going to focus more on the low Fodmap foods, and I'm going to see, do my symptoms improve? So for a lot of people with IBS, these types of foods usually are very problematic, but then some other people have different types of foods. So we want to understand why that is. And I wrote timing up here, but I don't really remember why I wrote that. I don't know. It'll come to me. But we also want to look at other contributing factors that can be creating and magnifying problems when we're looking at IBS. So we first want to understand that when we're looking at this digestive system, it's very common to see malfunctions in this digestive system here. And if you've seen any of my videos ever, you've heard me talking about malfunctions in this digestive system a lot. So what we want to look at when we're looking at IBS, first and foremost, is that we want to look at this study studying the overlap between IBS and GERD. And what they say here is that there is a strong overlap between GERD and IBS that exceeds the individual presence of each condition. In the absence of GERD, IBS is relatively uncommon. And that's what they found in this particular study. And I also want to see this study here of the effects of long-term PPI treatment on producing bowel symptoms and SIBO. And they say that prolonged PPI treatment may produce bowel symptoms and SIBO. Therefore, the strategy of step-down or on-demand PPI therapy could be encouraged in GERD. And finally, when we're looking at a connection between GERD and IBS and SIBO, this study here on the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and irritable bowel syndrome, are they predictors? They say here that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth was present in a sizable percentage of patients with IBS with predominance of bloating and flatulence. Older age and female sex were predictors of SIBO in patients with IBS. Identification of possible predictors of SIBO in patients with IBS could aid in the development of successful treatment plans. So we'll come back to this study in a second, but first just to dig into this a little bit, when we're looking at GERD, that's gastroesophageal reflux disease or some type of acid reflux situation. And when we have GERD, we're having acid from the stomach that's coming back up into that esophagus and burning the situation. Now, what we understand now is that reflux is not caused by having too much stomach acid like advertisers want us to believe. In most cases, it's caused by a lack of stomach acid. So there's this valve at the bottom of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter that opens so food can come back in, and then once that food is acidified, it will close so that stuff doesn't come back up and burn us. The problem is that valve is triggered by stomach acid. So when someone doesn't have enough stomach acid to trigger that valve to close, then the small amount that they have is going to come back up and burn them. So what we're seeing when we're looking at these connections between GERD and IBS is that it's very common to see a lack of stomach acid. If someone is having reflux, they're not having enough stomach acid. So that's one very important piece of information to consider. And when we're looking at why else would someone even have IBS in the first place, we need to understand that malfunctions are often going to be at play. So a lack of stomach acid, that's a malfunction. We saw that study that these issues and the SIBO is very common with PPI use, and PPI is a proton pump inhibitor that restricts the body's ability to produce stomach acid. That turns off that stomach acid so that the acid doesn't come back up and burn us, and it relieves that symptom. Does that make sense? But they're saying they're seeing SIBO a lot when they're using PPIs for an extended period of time, and SIBO is an overgrowth of bacteria here in the small intestine. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. All the cool kids have SIBO now. And what that means is that bacteria came in on the food that you were eating, and they made their way down here into the small intestine where they really shouldn't be. Our beneficial bacteria should be here in the large intestine. So This stomach acid is not just there to help us break down our food so that we can get the nutrients out of that food. That's kind of why we eat food. That stomach acid is also the barrier to the whole digestive tract. When bad guys come in on the food that they're eating, they're supposed to die in an acid bath. So when we have SIBO going on, where we have all this bad bacteria here that worked its way down into the small intestine, when we have that going on, it's usually because the front door is open. There's not enough stomach acid to kill the bad guys when they come in, so they come in and they set up camp and oh, this is a nice place. They set up camp here in the stomach, and then they work their way down into the small intestine, and eventually they can work their way into this large intestine too. And when they work their way down into the large intestine, they create what's called a dysbiosis issue, because you have too many bad bacteria kind of raising all this trouble for the good bacteria that are trying to do their job. So when we're looking at the level of invaders here in the system, that can be a really big part of this puzzle. And with a lot of IBS individuals, they'll do specific tests like breath tests to get an idea of what type of invaders may be going on in here. And when we go back to this study, they say also that hydrogen was the predominant gas detected in patients with IBS-D, or the diarrhea form, and methane was the gas detected in IBS-C. So the type of microorganisms here may have a playing role in what type of symptoms that a person is dealing with, whether they lean more towards the constipation or more towards the diarrhea. But these gases are created by these microorganisms in the body. They put off these gases. And when we're looking at these foods that seem to cause a lot of trouble with these high Fodmap foods, a lot of these foods are fermentable a little bit more than other types of foods. And bacteria have the ability to kind of break down our food for themselves, and a lot of this bacteria in the gut here in the large intestine is helping us break down our food so that we can access more of those nutrients. But the way that some of these bad guys break it down just creates a lot more gases, and gases in the wrong locations especially. So these gases become part of that kind of expand our intestinal tract and stretch it, and that can create that bloating and pain and cramping and a lot of the discomfort that goes along with that IBS. So it can have a lot to do with the type of bad guys that are kind of set up camp in this digestive tract. And there's a lot more to this digestive system than just the stomach acid. We have bile that comes down from the liver and gets stored in the gallbladder. And all those things also kind of trigger the pancreas to squirt these enzymes and bicarb and other things down that help us neutralize those acids and really break the food down correctly. So all of these steps kind of have to be happening in order for everything to work correctly and really be broken down. So it's very common for someone's bile to become too thick and sticky to flow correctly, and then that step will malfunction and it can cause malfunctions in these other areas as well. But in any case, to really break down the food, we need all of these things happening. So when that food can't be broken down, then it can eventually move down here, but it kind of breaks down by the process of rotting and or fermenting. And when there's a lot of these bad guys in here, it can really magnify that fermenting process and create a lot more gases. So if someone has enough stomach acid here, not only are they closing the door so all the bad guys can't come in, they're also breaking down that food the way that the body wants to break it down. And when that acid isn't there, now the body's like, well, what else am I going to do? I guess the food will just kind of sit there until it rots and ferments enough that it breaks down to at least a level where we can access some of those nutrients. The problem is that process of breaking the food down that way can create a lot of symptoms, and then when there's a lot of bad bacteria in here that are really going to magnify that fermenting process, it can really magnify those symptoms. Now, when we're looking at the constipation aspect of it, a lot of people don't know that the food bolus will kind of move through the system at a pace according to its acidity level. So if this food is really acidified and it doesn't get neutralized by like bile coming down from the gallbladder, or maybe it's not getting enough bicarb here to help out, when those things are not neutralizing the acids leaving the stomach, then it's still in this acidic state down here where it really shouldn't be. The stomach is made to hold those acids, but down here is not. So then it will move very quickly because the body's like, I got to get this out of here before it digests a hole in the intestinal tract. So it'll rush it through the back door and shoot us off the toilet like a rocket. So that can cause the stool to move very quickly. That's one possible cause for chronic diarrhea, not the only one. But when we're looking at constipation, It will often move slower when that stool is leaning too far on the alkaline side. When everything moving through here is too alkaline, it will move slower, which means it's going to get drier and harder and more difficult to move. And then the person's sitting on the toilet just cussing. So a lot of times it has to do with the pH of that bolus that's moving through the system. And if someone's not making enough stomach acid, then that's not going to be acidic enough to move at a proper pace. Here's another problem. A lot of these bacteria that will either set up camp in the stomach or the small intestine, they put out waste. And that waste can be alkaline. So they're further alkalizing both of these environments. If they're alkalizing the stomach more, it's even harder to acidify and break down our food. If they're alkalizing this environment in the small intestine, then that's going to make everything moving through there more alkaline, which means it's going to move even slower. So that can be part of what's creating constipation with someone with IBS-C. But we also need to understand water traffic a little bit. So it was Dr. Emanuel Rivisi who helped us understand that the body has this natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So during the day, the body should be in this catabolic state where it's very good at kind of creating energy and keeping us going all day. And it's also good at breaking down our tissues so that they can be rebuilt and renewed. That's how the body renews. And then at night, the body should move into this anabolic state where it's very good at sleeping and resting, but also this repairing and rebuilding. So both of these states are appropriate. We want both of those things. The problem is some people can get really stuck in one of these states most of the time, or maybe their body is just really crammed into one state. So what's important here when it comes to constipation is that in this anabolic state, the body will send more of the water to the kidneys, right here, and less to the bowels. And when less water is going to the bowels, it's going to get harder and drier and more difficult to move. And now I haven't pooped since Valentine's Day. So this is also a possible contributing factor when somebody is dealing with any type of chronic constipation issue. It doesn't matter if they have a fancy name, IBS-C, I got a fancy name, so my constipation is from that. Well, this can be a contributing factor if a person is leaning too far on this anabolic side. So when we're looking at this whole puzzle and we're trying to figure out, well, what do I do? What are the steps that I take? Well, if somebody's having a lot of discomfort, the first step is to adjust your diet. Make an adjustment to your diet. Try to eat more real food. A lot of these processed and junk foods and all these things include a lot of ingredients that have a lot of these Fodmaps that make it go a lot higher on that Fodmap scale. So when you can reduce your diet, does that help you feel better? Now, if you have digestive malfunctions, either there's not enough stomach acid or maybe bile is not flowing correctly, those things need to be corrected so you can actually break your food down. So the food is broken down like it should be and it doesn't have to rot and ferment and create all these magnified symptoms. So if you don't know how to do that or understand that, if you're new to this channel, we'll put a link to our totally free digestion course in the description below, and that'll walk you through figuring out which aspects of digestion are not working correctly and what steps can I take to improve those. And that course is free and that'll help you figure out what's right for you. I can't give you a plan right now because I don't know what your situation is. I don't know what's going wrong with you. There can be a variety of things. And we also want to look at those imbalances that could be going on. And that free course shows you how to do simple tests at home that you can do with tools you pick up at a pharmacy or a health food store. And that'll give you an idea. Am I leaning way too far on that anabolic side? And would correcting that help the body send more water to the bowels so I can poop like all the cool kids? And then if there's invaders, then we want to take steps to reduce that overgrowth, to reduce any type of overgrowth that's creating a lot of that trouble. So you can see there's steps that a person can take, but these steps are going to be different from person to person. It's really about looking at your body and figuring out which of these things are going to help you the most. If you're going to put effort in, you want to see results. So the effort that you put in needs to be appropriate for you, not just what all your friends are doing. But we hear from people all the time that create improvement to this whole situation. You can check our comments and you'll see them talking about how they've taken steps to improve the situation for themselves. So know that it's possible, that it's just going to take some work. Now, you taking these steps, is it going to automatically fix your situation? I don't know. Your situation could be a little more complicated, but the first step is to investigate what's going on with your body so you can see if any of these things line up for you. So I hope that helps. And right now, if you're dealing with both the constipation issues and the diarrhea issues, and maybe you go back and forth, or part of the day you're constipated and part of the day it's diarrhea, then you'll want to jump over and check out our video on steps to improve IBS-D so you'll understand all the things that can be contributing to that issue as well. And if you just want to look more into your digestion and understand what could be going wrong, you can jump over and check out our video on full digestive reset. I can't wait to hear about your results.